If you grew up on the west side of Chicago in the 1970s, the smell told you what shift it was. Burnt sugar in the morning meant the caramel lines were running. Chocolate by mid-afternoon meant the bridge mix was getting coated. And if the wind was coming off Cicero Avenue at the right angle, you could smell candy corn 3 neighborhoods away. That smell came from a 30-acre complex at 401 North Cicero, where, at the peak, 4,500 people made over 1 million pounds of candy a day. It was the largest candy factory in the world. By itself, it made Chicago the world's candy capital. And in December of 2003, after 80 years on that corner, they locked the doors. 4 years later, Christopher Nolan blew part of it up for The Dark Knight. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual ending. The biggest candy factory the world had ever seen got demolished in a Batman movie before it got demolished for real. Emil J. Brach came over from Germany in 1881. He was 22 years old, didn't speak much English, and took a job at Bunte Brothers, a Chicago candy maker. He saved every dollar he could. He sank his first savings into someone else's confectionery business and lost it. So when he started over, he was 45 years old, working with $1,000 and a chip on his shoulder. In 1904, with that $1,000, he opened a storefront at North Avenue and Town Street and called it Brach's Palace of Sweets. The whole operation was one copper kettle in the back. His sons, Edwin and Frank, stirred. He had one idea that changed everything. The candy makers in Chicago were charging 50 cents a pound. Brach charged 20 cents. He could do it because he made it himself, sold it himself, and skipped every middleman in between. People walked past 3 other candy stores to get to him. By 1911, that one kettle had become 50,000 pounds of candy a week. By 1923, he had 4 factories running flat out and could not keep up with orders. So he did the thing immigrant entrepreneurs do once in their life. He Béti everything, $5 million in 1923 money. Today, that is around $90 million. He put it all into one consolidated facility at Cicero Lake and Kinsey on the west side. 30 acres, 127 varieties of candy under a single terracotta logo, the largest candy plant on Earth. And the Brach family had one rule drilled into the sons by the old man: no debt. Ever. The kettles paid for the building, the candy paid for the kettles. Cash on the table. Then, in 1948, a spark hit a column of cornstarch on the 3rd floor. The explosion killed 11 workers and injured 18 more. Most of the north end of the complex was destroyed. The family rebuilt it bigger. By the early 50s, the factory was shipping more than 1 million pounds a day to grocery stores from California to Maine. In 1958, Brach's quietly invented something you've used 100 times without thinking about it. Pick a mix. Those wide bins of loose candy in the supermarket where you scoop and weigh and pay. That was them. They rolled it out nationwide, and within a few years, they owned the category. If you went grocery shopping in the Midwest in the 80s, you walked past those bins. Wide plastic tubs with metal scoops, the Brach's logo in primary color block letters, bridge mix, maple nut goodies, lemon drops, cinnamon discs. You picked your own. You scooped your own. The cashier wrote the weight in grease pencil on the brown paper bag. Your mom said 1 bag, and somewhere between the produce aisle and the checkout, a second one usually ended up in the cart anyway. By 1986, Brach's controlled 2/3 of every bagged candy sold in the United States. The Chicago plant was making $75 million a year in pre-tax profit on $640 million in sales. But the family was gone from it by then. In 1966, The founder's grandchildren, exhausted and not interested in running a candy empire, sold Brach's to American Home Products, a pharmaceutical conglomerate from Madison, New Jersey, for $136 million. American Home did not know much about candy, but for 20 years they mostly left the place alone. They did not fix what was not broken. The plant kept humming. And then there is the part of the story Chicagoans never quite get over. Frank Brach, the founder's son, had married a woman named Helen Voorhees in 1950. She had been a coat check girl in Florida when they met. Frank died in 1970. By then the company had been sold, but Helen had inherited a fortune in the tens of millions. She lived in a mansion in Glenview, gave generously to animal welfare causes, and made the mistake of trusting a con man named Richard Bailey, who was running a horse trading scam. On February 17, 1977, Helen Brach checked out of the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, after a routine appointment. She was supposed to fly home to Glenview. She never arrived. She is, to this day, the wealthiest American woman to vanish without a trace. Federal prosecutor Steve Miller, who filed the federal indictment in the case in 1994, called the horse swindle racket the dirty secret of the industry. Helen, prosecutors argued, had figured out she had been taken for millions in fake racehorse deals. She threatened to go to the FBI. She was murdered for it by a chain of people connected to the Chicago outfit. Investigators believe her body was dissolved in a chemical vat or burned in a steel mill blast furnace on the south side. Richard Bailey was convicted on a preponderance of evidence and got 30 years. He died in 2023. Whatever he knew went with him. The candy company outlived her, just not by much. In 1987, American Home Products sold Brach's to Klaus Jacobs, a Swiss billionaire who had built Jacobs Suchard into one of Europe's biggest chocolate and coffee firms. He paid $730 million in cash. Top of the market, more than 5 times what American Home had paid 21 years earlier. And then he did something that destroyed the company in slow motion. Jacobs fired Brach's top executives within months. He brought in Europeans from his Suchard chocolate operation, people who knew European chocolate consumption habits but had never set foot in an American supermarket. He cut the product line from 1,700 items down to 400. He renamed the company Jacobs Suchard Inc., a name no American shopper recognized, and he moved the headquarters out of the plant up to a penthouse office in one of Chicago's wealthiest suburbs, away from the floor where the candy was actually made. By the end of 1989, 2 years in, the company had lost $50 million. Sales had dropped from $640 million to $470 million. By 1994, Brach's had had 9 different CEOs in 7 years. 900 employees had been laid off, 42% of the workforce. In 1990, Klaus Jacobs sold the rest of his European candy empire to Philip Morris for $3.8 billion. Philip Morris took one look at Brach's and refused to buy it. And then the sugar trap closed. Here's the part most people don't know. The United States has a federal sugar program. The government uses tariffs and quotas to prop up the price of domestic sugar above the world price, sometimes way above. By the 1990s, American candy makers were paying roughly double what their competitors in Mexico and Canada were paying for the exact same ingredient. For a company that put sugar in literally everything it sold, that is not a disadvantage. That is a death sentence. Klaus Jacobs' bad management had weakened Brach's. The sugar program killed it. In 2003, K.J. Jacobs AG sold Brach's confections to another Swiss company, Barry Callebaut, the largest chocolate manufacturer in the world. The price was $1, plus the assumption of $16 million in debt. The price tag had gone from $730 million to $1 in 16 years. In late December, Brach's locked the Cicero Avenue doors for the last time. About 1,100 Chicagoans lost their jobs in the final wave. Production was moved primarily to a new factory in Linares, Mexico, across a border where sugar cost half as much and labor cost a third. The 30-acre complex sat empty for 4 years. In 2007, Christopher Nolan's crew came in and used the abandoned parking deck as Gotham General Hospital. In the film, the Joker, played by Heath Ledger, walks out into the street and detonates the entire structure. The explosion in The Dark Knight is real. Those are real Brach's walls coming down, real Brach's windows blowing out. The factory that made Chicago the world's candy capital was, for the first and only time in years, useful again as a stand-in for something blowing up. The rest of the buildings came down in 2014, 11 years after the last shift. Wreckers pulled the terracotta Brach's logo off the wall and threw it in a dumpster. A few pieces were rescued by neighborhood historians. The corner where 4,500 people once worked is now an industrial park. UPS rents space there. The Brach's brand itself is still around. Barry Callebaut sold it to Farley's and Sathers in 2007. Farley's and Sathers merged with Ferrara Pan Candy Company in 2012 to form the Ferrara Candy Company, which is, in one of those bittersweet Chicago twists, itself a Chicago candy maker, now headquartered in the renovated old post office downtown on Harrison Street. Candy corn and maple nut goodies still say Brach's on the bag. They're made in Mexico. Helen Brach disappeared in 1977. The factory she'd inherited, part of, disappeared 26 years later. Different methods. Same city. Emil Brach built it on a rule: never owe anyone anything. Klaus Jacobs broke the rule and the company. They moved the kettles to Mexico. They moved the brand to Ferrara. They moved the headquarters to the old post office. But you can't move a smell. And the West Side never smelled like chocolate again.